who are the Khazars? Khazars are a fascinating Turkic people who apparently had a capital on the Caspian Sea. You can see here in this German language map at the city of Itil, right in the top right section of the sort of orange part of this map, the pinkish orange part of the map. And they actually had a civilization which lasted for several centuries and interacted with many of the other surrounding civilizations, including famously the early state called Kievan Rus, which formed kind of like the beginnings of the cultural patrimonies that were claimed by Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia alike. Also a significant historical part of the conflict today. The Khazars were a pagan tribe, like many of the groups of the region, but according to some interesting documents that have made their way down to us today, they apparently converted to Judaism in the year 740. The story of their conversion is rather amazing. And it is perhaps most well told in a book that has very little to do with history and a lot to do with philosophy and polemics. It's a famous work by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who was a scholar who lived in Spain several hundred years after the events described, and he wrote this famous classic work of Jewish philosophy called the Kuzari, which really means the Khazarian. In the Kuzari, he describes the legend of the conversion of the Khazar king, King Bulan, who was sort of faced with a difficult choice because at that time, Christianity was expanding throughout Europe, and Islam was expanding all the way across the coast of North Africa, and then moving upward into Europe as well, into Turkey, into the Balkans, and so on. And this King Bulan was troubled by this geopolitical situation, and also apparently motivated, at least as the legend has it, by sincere spiritual longing to find the one true religion. So according to the legend, he brought together a sort of a trilateral debate team, a representative of Christianity, a representative of Islam, and a representative of the Jews. And they had this three-way debate. And ultimately, according to the legend, King Bulan converted to Christianity. Now, before we discuss the actual realities of the legend, we should understand how it is portrayed in the Kuzari. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lived at that time in Spain towards the end of its so-called Golden Era, which was a period of remarkable coexistence between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Jews in particular enjoyed tremendous freedoms to express themselves politically. Many of them held high office. There was a rather remarkable Shmuel ibn Agrela, who was actually the general of a Muslim army for 16 years, an accomplished poet, and a Talmudist to boot. All of these three things brought together in one particular individual. In many ways, a lot like Maimonides, who was also a product of the late Golden Era, although he would ultimately be a victim of the reactionary period when Muslims would come from North Africa and insist that all of this fraternizing with Jews was unacceptable, and the Maimonides family would later flee and make their way over to Cairo, where he would continue on an illustrious career. At any rate, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, seeing the sort of breakdown of this period, composed this philosophical work, which is set in that Khazarian debate between King Bulan and the three representatives of major world faiths. And he used it essentially as a foil to relitigate that case and to make a strong philosophical defense of Judaism, which of course results in King Bulan's affirmative decision to accept Judaism, and by extension, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is intending to make this available to the broader reading public, a rather audacious work to write in the Middle Ages. It would be audacious to write it even today, I think, in which it's a clear polemic against Islam and Christianity in favor of Judaism. So there was a lot of philosophical reason why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi would use the story of the Kuzari as a type of conceit to clothe his larger polemic argument. But what about the actual history of the Khazars? So in reality, we know very little about the Khazars as it is. Perhaps the most important piece of the story is some correspondence that was conducted between the Spanish leader named Khazari ibn Shaprut, a very important example of the early period of the Golden Age in Spain, who was a foreign minister, essentially, who conducted correspondence and diplomatic relations with many other nations of Europe on behalf of a Spanish kingdom. And he was especially curious and philanthropically inclined towards Jewish populations all over. So he wanted to find out, is it true? Is what they say happened back in the year 740 still true now? Is there actually a Jewish kingdom in this region of Khazaria? And so he sent out emissaries to go to the Far East, to Central Asia, and to communicate with them. Unfortunately, they were not able to get past Constantinople for various political reasons of the day. However, those emissaries of Khazari ibn Shaprut did meet people who claimed to have been to Khazaria and who promised to communicate with him and to exchange letters. And so they brought back with them some letters from one King Joseph of Khazaria, which essentially goes through the legend as we have it today. And for some, particularly early modern historians, that was sufficient proof of the existence and reality of Khazaria as we have it today. Other historians, however, have cast a lot of doubt, particularly in the 20th century, saying, wait a second here, this is, not direct contact with King Joseph. This is contact through third parties, and who knows, maybe they made it all up, maybe they are forgeries and so on. And so there's a lot of questions about the actual validity of the story associated with the conversion of the Khazars. We do know, however, from multiple data points that there were Jews who called themselves Khazarian. They show up in a few places. Medieval Jewish travelers encounter them. They have various things to say about them. They're certainly not in large numbers, and there's a lot of questions about the degree to which they are well associated with the Jewish tradition, as we shall see. One of those examples that I find quite fascinating is this document, which was found in the amazing medieval archive known as the Cairo Geniza. Very quick window here just to explain what that Cairo Geniza was, because it's just so fantastic. In Jewish thought, following on the commandment to not take the name of God in vain, there is this concept that if you write down the name of God on a document, that document, by virtue of its association with the name, acquires a level of sanctity. This is called in Hebrew Shemot, which means literally names, because it has the name of God on the paper. So what that means in Jewish practice, till today, is that, for example, if you have a prayer book, or certainly a Sefer Torah, or even certainly a Torah scroll, or even something a little bit more ephemeral, like a handout from school that may be given to children for homework, if it has a verse from the Torah, especially if it has a verse from the Torah with God's name in it, that document may not be simply discarded. It has to be treated very specially, and typically these documents are gathered together. Let's say a Torah scroll becomes invalidated from use, the letters are cracking and things like that, or prayer books become unbound, the spines break, things like that. You can't use it anymore, can't simply throw them away, so they are collected in one place called a geniza, which means like a storehouse or even a treasure house. And then at some point, when that geniza is full, these documents are taken to a Jewish cemetery and they are formally buried. That's considered the appropriate way to deal with these documents called shemot. It happened that the large Jewish community in Fustat, also known as Old Cairo, somewhat south of modern-day Cairo, had this custom of not only following the laws with regards shemot, but anything written in Hebrew characters was considered sacred, and therefore they put it in their geniza. Thankfully for generations of historians since the 19th century, the geniza was discovered because it was sealed up for a good 700 years, and there's this phenomenal trove of amazing documents of all types, not only, of course, religious works, including remarkable things like the actual autographed copy of Maimonides' writings and things like that, but also, casual things, because they believed that anything written in Hebrew had a level of sanctity. Hebrew characters even. So even if it's written like in Judeo-Arabic, which is essentially an Arabic language written with Hebrew characters, they would save those in the geniza. Everything from business contracts, marriage contracts, personal correspondence, shopping lists, children's doodles, all kinds of things. If it had Hebrew on it, it was put in the geniza. And included is this document that you see on your screen before you here. This is what we would call in modern Hebrew a petek, a small note that was essentially a letter of introduction for a charity collector. And those of you who live in strong Jewish communities today will certainly be familiar with this document, because typically when emissaries from a faraway community come to a local community to collect charity, they bring some kind of document which describes their credentials, describes the association that they have with some charitable institution. It's often signed by local rabbis or signed by famous rabbis, let's say in Israel, and they come door to door with this petek. Nowadays, it's usually laminated, and they say, I'm from this particular cause. I represent an orphanage or a hospital or whatever. Would you like to donate? And they present the document. That's exactly what this is, but it purports to be from a Khazarian Jew from Kiev. This is so-called Kievan document, which dates from, if I remember correctly, about the 10th century. And among the many interesting features is that the signatures of the local dignitaries includes this document, which is written in apparently a Turkic style of runes that indicates that there was one official who actually could not even write in Hebrew, had to use Turkic to express himself. So in other words, we have lots of interesting kind of like sideways evidence that something happened in Khazaria that resulted in some Jews living there. And Kiev, by the way, was well populated by Khazarian Jews. Lots of references to a Jewish gate and things like that in the literature. In fact, the great Ukrainian historian Omelian Pritsak opined that Kiev, as it's pronounced today in the Ukrainian pronunciation, Kiev was actually founded by Khazars, which is a kind of an interesting thought. One last piece of evidence that supports the idea of the Khazar conversion, although it doesn't tell us a lot about the depth of that conversion, is a very important document in the history of Eastern Europe called the Povest Vremen Yechliat, or the Chronicle of Bygone Years, in which the great Prince Volodymyr, Vladimir, who was the first Christian prince of this medieval state known as Kievan Rus, based in Kiev, Volodymyr had exactly the same conundrum as King Bulan did in Khazaria, meaning Christianity is expanding, Islam is expanding, I'm so confused, which religion should I accept? And so Volodymyr essentially repeats the whole Khazarian story with a little bit of a twist, because he has a representative of what would become Orthodox Christianity, especially after the schism of 1054, a representative of what would become Western Catholic Christianity, And so he has two Christian flavors represented, as well as a Jew and a Muslim. After having the debate, um, the Christian scholars who recorded the Chronicle of Bygone Years have very little to say that's good about Islam. That's sort of like dispensed with rather quickly. Judaism, however, Volodymyr considers very seriously. He says, wow, unlike the Muslims who are not allowed to drink alcohol, that was one of the reasons, by the way, that Islam was disqualified for Volodymyr. The Jews sound pretty good, and he came actually pretty close to converting to Judaism. Can you imagine what Eastern Europe would be like if Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine was predominantly Jewish? Hard to imagine. But when he found out that the Jews no longer had their own state in the land of Israel, he said, I'm going to pass, thank you. And he turned to the two Christian variations. He ultimately adopted what would be, of course, Orthodox Christianity, the Eastern Rite, and there was a mass baptism in the year 988, which begins the Christian period in Kiev and Rus, onward in the Slavic regions. So the Chronicle of Bygone Years, which was written a couple hundred years afterwards, also confirms the presence of Khazarian Jews. Now, what's at the heart of this? Is this possible, and are they connected to the Ashkenazi Jews? So the first thing we have to say is that many modern scholars today doubt virtually all of the aspects of the story of the Khazarian conversion. Perhaps the most eloquent advocate of this position is Professor Shaul Stampfer, who refers to it in a seminal article as a splendid story, meaning what a great story. It's so fascinating, the trilateral debate, the whole thing's like that. But he argues that it is either entirely fabricated by later writers, or it is at least highly exaggerated. I myself tend to lean towards the exaggerated to highly exaggerated, but I don't quite agree with my colleague, senior scholar Dr. Stampfer, that it is entirely fabricated. I just think there's the preponderance of evidence of the connection between Jews and Khazarians is sufficiently strong to argue that something happened, but I agree that there are a lot of questions. Like, for example, how widespread was this conversion? Was this possibly just a royal conversion that was designed to sort of mollify would-be attackers from the south and from the west, who would claim that it had to be either a Muslim or a Christian kingdom, respectively? Both Islam and Christianity have theological spaces in which Jews are allowed to maintain their religion. For Jews in Islam, it would be the Pact of Umar. For Christians, Jews are permitted to exist as Jews under the doctrine of witness from St. Augustine. So there was space for Jews to kind of have a neutral territory between Islam and Christianity. And so it's not impossible that at least at the very highest levels of Khazarian society, they may have had a pro forma conversion in order to maintain their geopolitical stance. Another argument revolves around, well, let's say they did convert to Judaism, and let's say it was only a thin conversion, but were they adhering to a rabbinic Judaism, or perhaps another variety like a Karaite Judaism? Who exactly were they? The various travelers' accounts that we have of people who encounter Khazarian Jews in one place or another tend to portray them as being fairly ignorant and of having very little awareness of many of the commandments that devolve upon them as good Jews. So, and of course, there's the huge question: where did they go? They seem to have disappeared from the history of Judaism afterwards. So, this essentially leads people like Dr. Stampfer to say that the burden of proof rests on those who want to indicate that Khazaria later expanded or at least maintained its position, because this is a civilization that lasted for 5 centuries, and then if they were Jewish, simply poof, they disappeared. they were ultimately conquered by Kievan Rus, and then we have a Mongol invasion that conquers the region, and then they simply don't appear on the world stage again. Further, well, let's get to the actual Khazar hypothesis. So here's the hypothesis that was advanced primarily by individuals who wish to impugn the status of contemporary Jews, especially Ashkenazi Jews, and there are some political connections, especially with the land of Israel. The Khazar hypothesis argues that, oh no, they didn't disappear. They actually constitute the bulk of the later Ashkenazic population. This is a hypothesis which can be immediately discarded on any number of grounds, primarily because there is no historical trace of Khazarian activity in later Ashkenazic civilization. Like, for example, linguistically, the Ashkenazium overwhelmingly, like even in 1900, 97% of them in the 1897 census listed Yiddish as their first language, and Yiddish is incredibly German in origin. It's overwhelmingly German in its vocabulary, in its syntax. It has maybe 20% of Hebraic and Aramaic words in it, a smattering of Romance words like Old French and things like that, but it has no strong connection to any Turkic language. It seems to be a completely divorced linguistic environment that is primarily associated with Germany. Billy Crystal, a comedian, likes to say that Yiddish is basically German with phlegm, which is kind of funny, but at any rate, so there's no linguistic representation. Secondly, we have a strong record of the migration of Jews from Rhineland to Eastern Europe. I mean, we can trace communities. We have a strong literary record of the customs that they accepted. We have, all kinds of material that supports the Rhineland origin of Ashkenazi Jews in Eastern Europe. We have no evidence that supports the idea that the Khazarians somehow became Jewish in large numbers and constituted the bulk of Ashkenazi Jewry. And finally, what kind of should put the end of the story to this debate with modern DNA research advances, many scholars, including Professor Eran Alhaik shown here, have shown that there's no Turkic elements in Ashkenazic Jewry, that overwhelmingly Ashkenazic Jews are related to the Western European origins of the Jews. We're going to explore this a little further. Now, let me just mention, why is it then that this hypothesis, and that's actually kind of like a dignified word for, again, to use Joe Biden's phrase, malarkey, why would this have so much currency? Because it essentially undercuts some of the major claims of Ashkenazi Jews to their connection, on a genetic level at any rate, to their biblical origins. In other words, it's a way of saying that, oh, those Ashkenazi Jews, they're not real Jews. They are, as some like to say, Jew-ish, right? They're not actually Jews. They pretend to be Jews, but they're not. It's basically a racist theory. It also has a lot of implications for modern Israeli politics, because it says that, hey, if you want to say that one of the main reasons why contemporary Jews have a claim on the land of Israel is because they are, after 2,000 years of exile, they are nevertheless the descendants of the people who lived in the Middle East at that time. If you want to say that, no, they're actually Central Asian peoples who later claim to be Jewish, then they don't have a claim to the land of Israel based on genetics. So there's a political motivation for supporting this kind of ridiculous theory. So where exactly, what can we say about the actual Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe? So as I mentioned, DNA research has helped us out tremendously in this regard. Dr. Doron Behar did some really excellent research in this region that gave us some rather surprising results. For example, that looking especially at Y chromosomes, about 40% of all Ashkenazic Jews actually trace their origins to 4 women. We don't know their names. I like to think of them as Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, but they are of European origin, most likely northern Italy, and overwhelmingly they are related to other non-Ashkenazi Jews like Sephardi Jews, Edot HaMizrach, and they are distinct from the peoples among whom they lived in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. What Dr. Behar was able to reconstruct with the kind of scientific tools that DNA research provides is kind of an interesting migration route that helps us understand more precisely on the basis of DNA research, particularly looking at Levites on the Y chromosome, because Levite status is passed through the father, and so therefore you have a much better connection. We can see that the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews have origins in the Middle East through Italy, which makes a lot of sense with the traditional model of understanding of how Jews, especially in the context of the Roman Jewish wars of the first century, many of them, Josephus says, in the tens of thousands, were deported to the Italian peninsula to serve as slaves. There was already a Jewish population before the revolts that was existing in Rome, for example. And then they made their way up through the peninsula by the time we get to the earliest Ashkenazic settlements, which will be in the next lecture in this series. And from there, as we discussed, move to Eastern Europe. The DNA trail follows the same trail that I described at the beginning of this lecture. Another route, which is labeled here with the number 5, the green route, which was always thought as a possible route of migration of Ashkenazi Jews across the coast of North Africa, because we do have Jewish settlements that appear, of course, in Egypt, places like Alexandria, and then in Tunis, and all the way over to Morocco, Berber Jews, and so on, that perhaps they ended up constituting the bulk of Ashkenazi population. That appears not to be the case, but there is a certain amount of admixture, particularly when you get to the high Middle Ages, of Sephardic Jews with Ashkenazim, as we discussed previously. So that's basically the story of how Ashkenazi Jews got to be called Ashkenazi and how they got to the Rhineland and then later to Eastern Europe and ultimately to the New World.